I begin this second lecture with a line from that great classic, The Night of the Living Dead, which I discussed in the first lecture. This is what was said in that movie, and it's a good way to begin the second lecture. If you kill the brain, you kill the ghoul, close quote. What is asserted here is that without a functioning brain, the zombies would be finished. However, with their functioning brains, revived from death by radiation, they remain the living dead, which is to say, active, sensing, hungry beasts, able to find and, alas, devour human flesh, but in the manner of some gruesome robot. If zombies are really like their portrayals, I can imagine one of them responding to the name George, and even running toward the zombie hotel when summoned by that name. What I cannot imagine is his knowing himself to be George, for a zombie presumably doesn't know anything. To know something is presumably to be conscious of it. And if the previous lecture reached a correct position on this matter, zombies aren't conscious. And as they are not conscious, they certainly are not self-conscious. Well, what about us? Are we conscious? And, except when sleeping, are we always conscious? And just what is that self, absent which one cannot be self-conscious? And just what is the relationship between consciousness and knowledge? Well, these are questions I'll address in this second lecture. Let me take the last question first, just to show that reasonable assumptions do not always pass philosophical muster. The claim, quote, "I am conscious of a rabbit in the garden," close quote, is clearly different from the claim, quote, "I know there is a rabbit in the garden," close quote, for one might well be conscious of what is actually a figment of the imagination. To know there is a rabbit in the garden requires, among other considerations, that indeed there is a rabbit in the garden. But to be conscious of a rabbit in the garden may be no more than to suffer from a kind of hallucination. Of course, one might also be utterly confused as to what one knows is in the garden. But there's a difference between being mistaken about what is out there and being mistaken in assuming that there is anything out there. Put more directly, there's a difference between a mistake and an hallucination. There is also a difference between being conscious of and being conscious. The former is always subject to error. The latter, it seems, is quite different in this regard. Being conscious or aware is to be the possible subject of an experience, whether at any time there is, in fact, the specific experience of anything. One might think of this as a system being on the air, though not yet tuned to any clear station or channel. The subject of possible experience is what in ordinary terms is often referred to as the self, as in myself. And it is to the concept of self that I now turn. In the older phenomenological literature, there is the common assumption that consciousness invariably includes a self. As Edmund Husserl expressed it, the self as such appears unfailingly with consciousness, in Husserl's German phrase, für sich selbst erscheinens. Here the German phrase captures the notion of consciousness as the simultaneous arrival or appearance of the self. Sartre makes the same point when he takes self-consciousness to be the very mode of experience and not merely a property of it. Indeed, it is, he says, the only mode of existence for there to be a consciousness of anything at all. Now, in the more current idiom, the same notion is conveyed by the idea of what it is like to be the subject of experiences. Common though this way of phrasing the matter is, I'm wary of it, for it seems to require some sort of conceptual bridge to take us from what it is like to have thoughts, desires, feelings, etc., across the bridge to ourselves as thinking, desiring, and feeling beings. I am going to try here to avoid the what it is like to be locutions, even at the risk of philosophical naivete. Instead, I will say straight away that every conscious moment is someone's, but that every conscious moment does not invariably focus on that fact. If philosophical terms are useful in dealing with matters of this sort, I would say that there is a difference between what is called unreflective and reflective consciousness. It would be odd, after concluding the morning shower, for a person to maintain a disciplined conversation with herself of the sort, "I am now looking in the mirror, I am now drying my right cheek, I am now looking for the talc." Rather, all sorts of semi-automatic initiatives are taken without any reflective self-consciousness at all on the part of the actor. For there to be knowledge, motives, desires, beliefs, there must be consciousness. But these features of mental life are often in operation without the actor reflecting on each or all of them, or perhaps even any of them. Reflective consciousness is something else again. Here we recognize not only that conscious experience invariably includes self-consciousness, as what Sartre called the mode of its very existence, but the focus is on self as the subject or the source. But what or who is this self? We might begin our inquiry by considering an old sailing vessel in serious need of repair. The wooden planks are rotten, the mast is wormy, and the sails in shreds. Let's call the ship Old Faithful. Buying it at a cheap price, we have funds remaining to restore it to its pristine condition. We hire craftsmen and give them an ample enough budget to buy new wood and new sailing cloth. They proceed to remove each plank and replace it with new boards, now sanded and covered with a high-quality marine shellac. In time, we see Old Faithful as it might have appeared to its original crew. But is this Old Faithful? Should we not call it Son of Old Faithful, or Old Faithful 2? Now suppose we take the old rotten planks and have the workmen assemble these to form another vessel, now made only of the original materials. In light of the difference in the composition of the two vessels, one would be hard-pressed to decide which should be regarded as Old Faithful. One of the ships, fully repaired, shares none of the history of the original vessel. The other has all the original material, but is scarcely seaworthy. It's scarcely a ship at all, for it cannot function as a ship. What if an observer, aware of all this, insists that neither vessel is Old Faithful, for Old Faithful disappeared when all of its constituents were removed? For something to be itself, it must have continuity over time. Note, however, that none of the constituents of our own bodies remains constant over time. And in light of that fact, it might be argued that there is no self as such, for everything about us physically changes from moment to moment. To the extent that our, quote, self just is all of these constituent parts working together in the proper way, and to the extent that each of these parts undergoes constant change, there simply cannot be an enduring self at all. Or so one line of argument would have us believe. Now, against all this is a venerable philosophical conception of entities that do retain their identity over time and independently of all physical changes. On this understanding, a thing is what it is essentially, even if a number of so-called accidental changes happen to be imposed on it. Thus, even though Smith changes from infancy through childhood and into adulthood, there is some essential Smith whose identity remains constant. Suppose Smith in childhood takes up the violin. We would say later that Smith is a musician. But we would mean something different from what we would mean when saying that Smith is a man. Smith could not be what he is were he not a human being. But Smith would continue to be a human being had he never learned how to read music or play a musical instrument. In the language of Aristotle and his scholastic commentators, Smith is a man essentially, a musician accidentally. Well, let me move now to a later chapter in the history of thought, to those 17th century giants of scientific thought, especially Newton and Galileo, who persuaded the leading intellectuals of the age and of following ages that the last word on what really matters is to be provided by science. Increasingly, notions of essences and substances came under critical scrutiny. The example of Old Faithful differs only slightly from an actual example discussed by Thomas Hobbes. In his example, it was the ancient ship of Theseus that was the subject of analysis. This is the ship that legend has sailed by Theseus from the Greek mainland to the island of Crete, where King Minos had been appropriating Athenian youth for years, only to have them sacrificed to the beastly Minotaur deep within the island's fabled labyrinth. In freeing Athens from this horrid tyranny, Theseus became a great hero, his ship taken from port to port, year after year in celebration of his great victory over the Minotaur. And yes, in time, the planks had to be replaced, as with our example of Old Faithful. Now, what does Thomas Hobbes have to say about this? It's in his De Corpora, Concerning the Body, published in 1642, that we find the chapter titled Of Identity and Diversity, and it's in that chapter that he treats of the ship of Theseus. Regarding this ship, Hobbes says, in a manner both arcane and convinced, quote, "If that ship of Theseus, concerning the difference whereof made by continual reparation in taking out the old planks and putting in the new, the sophisters of Athens were wont to dispute, were after all the planks were changed the same numerical ship it were at the beginning, and if some man had kept the old planks as they were taken out, and by afterwards putting them together in the same order, had again made a ship of them, this without doubt had also been the same numerical ship which it was in the beginning, and so there would have been two ships numerically the same, which is absurd." Close quote. Well, how shall we put it today? Two distinguishable entities cannot be the same. Hobbes must argue for a sense of identity that does not collapse into such absurdities. There is, of course, a sense in which the water in the river is the same as the water now forming the cloud. There is a sense in which it is different. There's a sense in which Socrates as a child is different from Socrates as a man. Regarding personal identity, we ask, what is the sense in which it has continuity amidst the corporeal fluxes of the hour and of the lifetime? Well, let's again consult Thomas Hobbes. Quote, "That man will always be the same whose actions and thoughts all proceed from the same beginning of motion, namely that which was in his generation. And that will be the same river which flows from one and the same fountain, whether the same water or other water, or something else than water, flow from thence, and that the same city whose acts proceed continually from the same institution, whether the men be the same or no." Close quote. Here the ever mechanistic thinker accepts the continuity of the person throughout the seasons of bodily change, so long as one condition is satisfied, and what is that? The same beginning of motion, namely that which was in his generation. Hobbes rejecting here Aristotelian essences in favor of the identity of functional states. All in all, Hobbes's treatment would set the stage for John Locke's analysis of this same issue and his own conclusions regarding the continuity of material man, but the alteration of that man's person. Now, to see how Locke attempts to render all this conformable to the science of his time, we begin with his anti-essentialism. In an essay concerning human understanding, Locke develops the distinction between what he called real and what he called nominal essences. The central thesis is developed in Book 3, Chapter 6. Here Locke notes that any number of creatures of Locke's own general form, or of considerably different form, might have more or better faculties than Locke himself, but that such differences are not in any way, quote, essential to the one or the other, or to any individual whatever, till the mind refers it to some sort of species of things, close quote. In other words, what we come to regard as the essence of something arises from our own tendency to classify or categorize it in a manner that is convenient or useful by our own lights. What will give Locke or anyone else that continuing identity that might have been incorrectly regarded as one's real essence is no more than that on which the various habits and dispositions of the mind happen to settle. What we come to regard as the essence of a thing or of a person is just a set of features to which we have reliable perceptual access and are stable enough to permit classification. Imagine the world and ourselves to be just what we are, with one exception. No one has ever eaten an apple or has ever been able to eat an apple. Rather, apples came to be used as, and were called, paperweights. We would by now agree that these round red objects that fall from trees are, quote, essentially paperweights. Here it is the manner in which human intelligence perceives and uses entities that will determine their, quote, nominal essence, that is, the essence they have as we name them to be the kinds of things we take them to be. Following Hobbes, Locke gave the problem of personal identity its modern formulation. One of the aims of his essay was precisely to challenge essentialism. Faithful to Newtonian science, Locke regarded the real essence of a thing to be beyond the powers of perception. The real essence is at the most fundamental, corpuscular structure of a thing, manifesting itself, if at all, only at that perceptible level on which variable, context-dependent, nominal essences are fashioned. Locke's real essence is a congeries of submicroscopic particles held together by gravitational forces. But the perceptible Locke is that body of features generating such nominal characterizations as physician friend to the Earl of Shaftesbury, Fellow of the Royal Society, a rational animal, etc. These characterizations arise from conventional discourse, from the contingencies of culture and context, from the nuances of perception, memory, and mental life. It would be fair to say, in light of Locke's reference to the real essence of things, that he is what might be called an ontological essentialist. He does believe that there are essentially existing items, but agnostic at the level of epistemology. He accepts that there is a real essence, but he rejects the claim that this real essence is given to us in our observations of anything. Even if science were to attain perfected methods of measurement with which to identify the real essence of an item or entity, it would not match up with the manner in which we come to know and describe it. Consider quanta, for example. Now, consistent with the distinction between real and nominal essences, Locke reduces personal identity to the merely contingent contents of consciousness, such that the notion of an essential self gives way to an identity that is hostage to the limitations of memory and the vagaries of experience. There is an intimation of the real versus nominal distinction in Locke's famous example of the prince and the cobbler. The two of them, the prince and the cobbler, retire for the night. While each is sleeping, the contents of their respective consciousness are switched. Now, once the two awaken, Locke grants that each will be the same man, but not the same person. Each remains the same man, the reference here to a physical body. But the person, as that person would disclose what he takes to be his essential self, is but a series of recollected experiences that constitute one as being a prince or a cobbler. The real essence of neither is disclosed by such nominal features as a princely bearing or special skill in turning leather. Locke is clear on this point. Personal identity, he says, consists, quote, not in the identity of substance, but as I have said, in the identity of consciousness, wherein if Socrates and the present mayor of Coimbra agree, they are the same person. If the same Socrates waking and sleeping do not partake of the same consciousness, Socrates waking and sleeping is not the same person, close quote. Now, how does all this play out in the matter of self-consciousness and that vexing self of self-consciousness? Older philosophical schools tended to identify self with soul, which is to say, with an enduring feature of the individual, immune to changes that otherwise alter the conditions of the body. On this understanding, behind all the changes that might take place in the life of John Smith, there is an essential John Smith, his essential self, the spiritual center of his being, which remains unchanged throughout the seasons of life. If Locke's metaphysical mission is one of Newtonianizing the mind, then the first step must be the elimination of such worrisome non-physical items as essential selves and the seemingly dual nature of reality, partly physical and partly, well, something else. Locke is considered one of the fathers of British empiricism. The word itself is based on the ancient Greek for observation and observer, empireia, empirikos. In its various forms, empiricism reduces all that is factually knowable to what is observable or to what is subject to perception. If there is a self, then, at least on this empirical account, it must be something subject to observation and perception, something answering to the data of experience. And if there is a continuing personal identity, then it too must be recognized at the level of perception. For Locke, this had to be found within the contents of consciousness, or more specifically, in the stores of memory. If we regard the personal identity of someone as analogous to Old Faithful, then we can say that to the extent the various old planks of memory continue to be present in consciousness, the personal identity of the individual has been preserved. But does any of this have anything to do with self-consciousness? I don't refer here to the shy person who is, as we say, too self-conscious, but to all of us in those times when we are awake, alert, and mindful, a good word, mindful. Consider again Locke's example of the prince and the cobbler. After their conscious contents are transferred, the prince's into the mind of the cobbler and vice versa, Locke tells us we now have persons switched, but not bodies. In today's hypothetical thought experiments, the example would call for an exchange of brains. Locke tells us that next day the two will awaken, quote, the same man, but not, quote, the same person. To be the prince is not to have a body of a specific type, but to have those spatio-temporally connected experiences that add up to what the prince can call up into consciousness, and so too with the cobbler. However, even granting this much, it's still obvious that on the next day, each will be aware, attentive, alert, and in a uniquely personal and mental contact with the surrounding world. Each will not merely be the subject of experiences, but will experience these as his own experiences, experiences that cannot be had in just this way by any other. The person who is totally amnesic is not lacking in self-consciousness, though he may be said to have lost his Lockean personal identity. Now, Locke knew this much, which is why, for all this empiricistic commitment on his part, he granted that we know ourselves to be the subjects of our own experiences intuitively, his adverb, and surely not as a result of systematic observation. William James faced the complexity of this issue head-on and labored valiantly to keep both feet on the ground. In Chapter 10 of his Principles of Psychology, he devotes an entire section to an analysis of the different senses of the self, including the material self, the social self, and at last, the spiritual self. And of this he writes, quote, "I mean a man's inner or subjective being, his psychic faculties or dispositions. These are the most enduring and intimate part of the self, that which we most verily seem to be. This spiritual self may be considered in various ways. We may divide it into faculties, isolating them one from another. This is an abstract way of dealing with consciousness. Or we may insist on a concrete view, and then the spiritual self in us will be either the entire stream of our personal consciousness or the present segment or section of that stream, according as we take a broader or a narrower view. But whether we take it abstractly or concretely, our considering the spiritual self at all is a reflective process, is the result of our abandoning the outward-looking point of view, and of our having become able to think of subjectivity as such, to think ourselves as thinkers." Close quote. It's hardly necessary to point out that we do not surround our thoughts about things with moment-to-moment reminders that the thoughts are ours, and therefore that we can be confident that we are self-conscious. Nor do we contemplate deeply before reaching the confident belief that up is not down and black is not white. So when Locke speaks of something known intuitively, he employs the traditional and the essentially medieval criteria. What is known intuitively is known to be true. It's known to be necessarily true, and it's known without deliberation. Locke thought our knowledge of God and of ourselves was intuitive in this sense, whereas our knowledge of the necessary truths of geometry would be demonstrative, in that formal argument would be required to demonstrate the truth of conclusions in geometry. Now, apart from these special cases, the intuitive and the demonstrative, Locke argued that all of our factual knowledge, all the information with which the mind is furnished, comes in his terms from experience. That we know ourselves intuitively is a proposition, however, not without its own difficulties. If indeed this is how we know ourselves, it still seems odd to use a verb that generally stands for the acquisition of knowledge that can be shared. But if self-knowledge is intuitive, meaning that it arises from sources entirely internal, how can we know that there is any other self, any other consciousness? How can we know that there are other minds? Moreover, to know oneself, intuitively or otherwise, should leave room for the possibility of being mistaken. That up is not down, and that a thing cannot simultaneously be and not be, are examples of what might be regarded as the starting point of all knowledge. But it's less clear that an intuitive knowledge of oneself must be included among the necessary starting points. Zombies, if their behavior is to be successful at all, conform to the law of contradiction, even as we grant that they have no intuitive comprehension of it, for they are mindless. If consciousness is not necessary to account for seemingly mental achievements, why would self-consciousness be requisite? And is it really the case that in all circumstances a person knows as a necessary truth and immediately that the thoughts occupying consciousness are his own? Might there be instances of pathology such that knowledge of this sort is less than certain and therefore not regarded as a necessary truth? And if this is possible in instances of pathology, might the normal case depend on the health and proper functioning of the brain? And if this is so, then is not the knowledge in question actually contingent and not necessary? Well, later lectures will leave room for a consideration of this. For now, however, let's leave the ship of Theseus and Old Faithful, as well as Locke's Prince and Cobbler, and begin to think of just how it is we're sure that there are minds other than our own.